Hi, I'm Jennifer Baker, and I'm so happy to be speaking on Stockdale and Stoicism today. When we think of Stoicism, we associate it with heroicism. That's natural. But we also seem to associate it with what philosopher and Stoic Larry Becker calls a pitiless perfectionism, a pitiless perfectionism. And I think part of this idea of perfectionism might include that we defer to rules if we're Stoics, rules we've agreed to, perhaps rules we've signed up for, rules that others count on us to follow with less difficulty than others. Because, after all, what's the problem with following a rule for a Stoic? So in this talk, I just want us to think together about two things. I want us to focus on Admiral Stockdale's experience as a Stoic, as a prisoner of war, to remind us that the Stoics are going to have a criteria for which rules we follow and which rules are good. And I also just want to remind us that experts in Stoicism are sources of theoretical insight. They aren't just examples of the view applied. So they should get us to revise the theory. And these experts would, in Stoicism, be people who are under the gun, as Admiral Stockdale put it, those testing the view and putting it to use in a challenging life. Admiral Stockdale might be known to you already, and he is a role model in multiple ways. To quote Admiral Vern Clark, Stockdale challenged the human limits of moral courage, physical endurance, and intellectual bravery. He emerged victorious as a legendary beacon for all to follow. In his second tour over North Vietnam, he was shot down, very badly beaten by villagers, and then inhumanely imprisoned for over 8 years. Much of that time, about half of that time, spent in solitary confinement. He earned the Congressional Medal of Honor, 4 Silver Star medals, 2 Purple Hearts, 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses. He has multiple books and essays. I want to use the evidence of his own explanation to emphasize that along with a long list of virtues, qualities I couldn't begin to describe, he was also practically rational. And he demonstrates how practical rationality works for a Stoic or for anyone interested in ancient accounts of virtue. I want to suggest that until practical rationality is included, featured, given pride of place in a Stoic virtue ethics, that we haven't yet accounted for what it is the virtuous understand about why they act as they do. It's the case that acting in accordance with the proper understanding of value might become second nature. It's the case that being virtuous might include some behavior that's nearly automatic, that a novice can't even approximate. But I want to suggest that this doesn't require or imply that the understanding of why a Stoic acts the way they do ever leaves, or that it wasn't necessary in the first place. On a Stoic account, the virtuous are not mere role models. They have knowledge of the accurate account of right and wrong. And I know this doesn't sound modern to a lot of contemporary ears. This doesn't sound plausible. I can imagine some of the skepticism. If Stoics have the accurate account of right and wrong, why don't they just tell us what it is? Why don't they show us this account? And I'm going to look at Stockdale as an example of how someone acts when they do have the right approach to what's right and wrong. So in context, Stockdale is going to show us something that's right and something that was wrong. Philosophers have had skepticism about Stoicism because of the role of practical rationality. Robert Johnson, in a frequently reprinted critique, depicts its Aristotelian ethics, but he depicts it as having offered no further explanation of moral reasoning or moral behavior than that the virtuous, simply in virtue of their virtues, know what they are supposed to do. He mocks this idea. He describes a person who's honest as having done nothing over and above simply deciding to tell the truth from now on. Other critics, such as those inspired by social psychology or the situationist critique in philosophy, John Doris was an early example of such a critic. They suspect that the rationality virtue ethics requires is not realistic given how we operate, given our psychologies. So either of these sorts of approaches risks giving us the concern that practical rationality, as Stoics describe it, is really a mysterious or idealized process, something about which we should be suspicious. But I want to suggest that practical rationality is not mysterious, and we actually engage in it all of the time, even if it does look a little complicated when described. I really like this description from David Wiggins. I think it is a reminder we do breeze over this component in many of our accounts of virtue. He writes that no theory, if it is to recapitulate or reconstruct practical reasoning, even as well as mathematical logic recapitulates or reconstructs the actual experience of conducting or exploring deductive argument, can treat concerns which an agent brings to the situation as forming a closed, complete, consistent system. For it is to be the essence of these concerns to make competing and inconsistent claims. This is not a mark of irrationality, but of rationality in the face of the plurality of ends and the plurality of human goods. The weight of the claims represented by these concerns is not necessarily fixed in advance, nor need the concerns be hierarchically ordered. Indeed, a man's reflection on a new situation that confronts him may disrupt such order and fixity as had previously existed and bring a change in his evolving conception of the point, or at several or many points, of living and acting. If that's not crystal clear, we have Stockdale, I think, as an example of exactly what Wiggins is describing. Stockdale's own descriptions help us distinguish, for example, descriptions of virtue and the process that explains becoming virtuous in the first place. Practical rationality is crucial for that process. Our descriptions of virtue might come from afar or a bit of distance. This is a short essay he wrote in 1995, and it's a reminder, even this passage is a reminder of what Julia Annis has written, that virtue is not a mindless habit which bypasses the agent's own practical reasoning. It's instead a disposition to act, exercised through the agent's practical reasoning. It's a disposition built up as a result of making choices, not a causal deposit within the agent of the effects of past behavior. So here I think we see Stockdale giving us information about how he began to see himself differently, not aloof, as he puts it, but in a sense detached from procedures and orders due to his study of Stoicism. Let me emphasize what Stockdale's approach and our present emphasis on practical rationality in this talk doesn't encourage. So it doesn't encourage simple arguments that we be brave or prudent or name any virtue you'd like. I have referred to these types of arguments as arguments from virtue. And I mean to distinguish them because they are going to assume we know what virtue is or what it should be like in advance, so that we're very confident about the virtue and then we're just recommending it. And I think Stockdale really dispels the notion that a Stoic can depend on, common conceptions, agreement on what a virtue is, and that reflecting on that guides us in difficult situations. I also think he dispels the idea that a Stoic is a pitiless perfectionist. If you read this passage, Stockdale is pointing out that we need rules. I might call them norms rather than rules, because they're more prevalent than just listed rules, but we certainly get examples of listed rules in Stockdale's story, and that we need these in order to organize others and ourselves, organize ourselves internally and organize our behavior along with others. There's some really good research on the role of norms in social organizations. I've learned a lot from it, how norms impact us, how we're motivated to follow them, that we make decisions about whether to follow norms and rules based on our estimate of whether others will follow them. I think all of that is compatible with Stockdale has what he's explained. even though he ends up putting in a new mode of operation, as he calls it, altogether, a new mode of operation altogether. And I do think this example from Stockdale outpaces what has been discovered by social scientists on norms. He's a special case. And I can imagine that those who are already interested in Stoicism not being as interested as I am in the role of norms and rules in Stoicism. And I do want to point out that Stockdale does report success with the men under his command in the prison, even though they weren't Stoics. But I want to suggest that we can attribute this to his focus on the conflicting claims that were mentioned in Wiggins' description and his coming up with normative propositions that worked rather than any reminder to the men to be virtuous or any reference to virtue terms. I mean, he's very cautious about how he serves as a role model. He's very cautious about even mentioning Stoicism to the men because he tried it and it didn't work. So his being a role model, I'm sure, certainly helped, but I want to focus on how he role modeled the design of rules through practical reasoning. If you still have in mind Wiggins' description of practical rationality, he suggests again that we're going to run into conflicting claims we need to sort through, and that we're going to need to come up with normative propositions that work. And this is exactly what Stockdale discovered as a POW attempting initially to abide by the code of conduct. In his writing, Stockdale emphasizes the role of indifference for a Stoic, the recognition of what is not up to you, the category of external goods, even how to communicate and lead as a Stoic, as I mentioned. But I also want to highlight that he encounters through his experience the notion of a form of harm that he calls Stoic harm. I think that's a very useful term to distinguish it from more obvious and physical harm. As Stockdale explains, becoming a POW from the start gave him a new realization of our mutual fragility. As he put it, you can be reduced from leading over 100 pilots and 1,000 men to taking the ropes in a matter of minutes. He found that our attitudes alone, even if they were his type of attitudes, even if they're Stockdale attitudes, are not going to hold up under the most dire challenges, to me, unimaginable challenges, but torture, for example. And of course, we might say that virtue involves attitudes. Attitudes span our affective and cognitive responses, and that's what virtue is said to involve. How exactly virtue affects attitudes, I think is unsettled, still unclear, but attitudes aren't the same as virtue. Virtue is not made up of attitudes. We can have the right attitudes, but for many reasons fail to develop any corresponding virtue. We're also, I want to suggest, not going to be guided by attitudes in the way we're guided by rules. I want to suggest, especially if Stoicism is useful to an enlisted person, the issue of rules is vivid. And I don't want to fail to acknowledge that without Stoicism, we figured out all sorts of ways to understand rules, refine rules, apply them, get necessary feedback about the application of rules. And, of course, these methods don't depend on Stoicism. But I do think Stoicism provides a certain type of guidance on how and why rules matter, and Stockdale's going to show us that. Stockdale understood a prisoner giving up only his name, rank, serial number, and date of birth would incite more torture, knowing the importance for his fellow service members to live as what he referred to as an honorable prisoner. Stockdale allowed the prisoners the grace to yield under pressure as long as only useless information was given to their captors. And so he created new rules. Let me give a list of the benefits of stated rules like these, revisions to rules that lead to Stoic harm. These are normative propositions we state out loud, try to memorize. One benefit of this is that they then can be tested. We've just seen that some sets of rules fail, and this one, we're told, succeeded. Second benefit of listing out rules like this is that they have motivational effects. So rather than trying to motivate someone to have a better attitude, however that's done, if we argue for one rule over another or for one norm over another, we're dealing with constructs that already have motivational appeal. It seems like less of a losing proposition. The third reason is kind of a safety. If it turns out to be the case that our moral reasoning, as some psychologists have been suggesting, like Jonathan Haidt, is post hoc, so it comes after our behavior, we kind of justify what we've done after we've done it, and we make quick decisions about what to do, then the role of norms and stated rules still assist in the process of moral reasoning because it gives us a handle with which to get at explanations of our behavior. It's almost as if rather than nothing, we have something with which to compare our behavior to. A fourth reason that listed rules can be helpful is that they suit the need for what philosophers call second-person normative force of claims. So if you just are interested in being virtuous and you're just interested in developing the qualities of a virtuous person, one gap would be what you can say to others. When a virtuous person, someone interested in Stoicism, develops rules or norms, we can then instruct others with these, using ourselves and our abiding by these rules as an example. It's important, philosopher Mark Labar puts it this way, that we be able to insist our moral claims have some force that applies to others. It's important for the justification of the rules we follow ourselves. And then I would suggest it's also important for coordination of others. And finally, specified norms or rules are going to serve as objects for an agent's own moral deliberation of whether or not they match up with behavior. So if we recommend a mere virtue or an attitude, we're not leaving a role for the agent when it comes to how to understand or apply that attitude or virtue. As the ancients pointed out, when following any norm, an agent still has to ask herself or already have decided whether she's doing so in a way that's honorable, beneficial, or if there's any conflict between either of those appearances. Specifying norms in our recommendation, even to ourselves, is another way to refer back to the actual process involved in moral reasoning. I hope this has been enough to suggest that Stockdale, among his other virtues, had that of practical reasoning and sure put it to the test. Thank you so much.